I'm Brian Guido Hassan, and I was invited to give this talk to the team of iScribes, a high-growth startup headquartered in Durham, North Carolina, that outsources and automates the scribe function in the medical industry. I was given the opportunity to talk about anything about which I was passionate, anything that I thought would be particularly relevant for their team. Given my own experience in high-growth startups, I reflected back and remembered that often one of our biggest challenges was really around leadership, as employees who were brought on originally in individual contributor roles were suddenly foisted into new roles in which they were expected to lead and manage others, often with very little preparation or training. So, for us, leadership challenges were often one of the greatest sources of friction to growth. And so I decided to focus this talk around entrepreneurial leadership. Now, we all know how entrepreneurship works, right? It starts with someone having some amazing idea, perhaps some child prodigy with a technical idea, or alternatively, maybe it's an MBA type with some keen market analysis. But either way, there's clearly a recognized opportunity, and around that opportunity, the protagonist builds a detailed business plan, probably 50 or more pages with beautiful charts and graphs, and uses that to secure millions of dollars of venture capital. At which point, the venture becomes something of a self-fulfilling prophecy. It experiences hockey stick-like growth, and our protagonists ultimately achieve the amazing end goal of an IPO, using the proceeds to buy a private island or perhaps a professional sports team. This is how entrepreneurship happens, right? Very straightforward, very linear, and of course, very false. The way entrepreneurship really happens isn't nearly as linear. There are ups and downs and left turns every step of the way. The media tends to mythologize this linear path of entrepreneurship, and it's a disservice to entrepreneurs and to entrepreneurial leaders because we often try to learn about entrepreneurship through this model that doesn't really apply to real entrepreneurial ventures. So I'd like to focus instead on kind of real entrepreneurship and what insights we can learn about entrepreneurial leadership from it. While I've spent my career in tech startups, primarily in kind of green energy tech startups, and have had some pretty big successes and also some less than successes, I also spent 2 years as the inaugural entrepreneur in residence at Rice University, where we built one of the top-ranked entrepreneurship programs in the United States. And so my perspective in this talk is informed not just by my experience as a practitioner of entrepreneurship, but also in my roots in the actual academic research around entrepreneurship and leadership. What I'd like to do is first spend a little time just arguing that the way we currently view leadership in startups is somewhat broken. Then take a bit of a deep dive into actual academic research around what makes entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship effective. And then finally see if we can tease out some insights about leadership from that research and from some of my own experience. So first things first, let's agree on a definition of what a startup actually is. There are as many definitions as the day is long. I prefer one that comes from Steve Blank, who's a multiple-time entrepreneur himself, as well as a professor of entrepreneurship at Stanford and Cal Berkeley. And he contends that a startup is a temporary organization used to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. And I think that's a really good definition, not only because it's succinct, but because there are a couple of key words there. One is that a startup is temporary, right? You don't start a startup with the intention of it always being a startup. It aspires to become something else or to fail quickly so that you can move on to something else that might be the next billion-dollar company. But also the actual verb that is used to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. This really gets to the crux of the difference between large companies and startups. Large companies execute known business models, while startups are actually searching for unknown business models. And you use very different techniques to search effectively for something unknown than you use to execute something known. This is an important distinction because for decades, we've thought of leadership in startups as if startups are simply small versions of large companies. So we can apply the same leadership lessons from large companies to startups. However, startups are provably not small versions of large companies. They have very different challenges and they use very different tools to make them successful. One of the tools that large companies use to achieve success is planning, right? Large companies are always planning, quarterly planning, annual planning, budgeting, and it's a good tool for executing known business models. However, Mike Tyson has a great quote that I think is extremely applicable to the startup context, that everyone's got a plan until he gets punched in the face. Right? Startups are always getting punched in the face, whether it's by customers telling them that they don't want the product that the startup's been building, or investors telling them that they're not as investable as they thought they were, or whether it's even employees telling them that, well, yeah, we're not quite willing to work for free. Startups are always getting punched in the face, and plans are very poor tools for environments in which you're getting punched in the face. And for that reason, the traditional leadership that's very good at planning, very good at executing known business models, simply doesn't cut it in the startup world. So if you'll believe me that the kind of current view of startup leadership is somewhat broken, let's then take a look at things we actually do know about what does work in the startup world. There's a significant amount of quote unquote thought leadership in entrepreneurship, but very little rigorous academic research. There is some, however. There's a growing body of work called effectuation, in which they looked at a group of multiple time successful entrepreneurs, where they counted success as having built something from scratch to at least $100 million of value. And specifically, we're looking at entrepreneurs with multiple successes, so not ones who could have just been in the right place at the right time or succeeded in spite of themselves, and really tried to identify commonalities in everything from their psychologies to their problem-solving abilities, even their physiologies. One of the first insights to come from effectuation research is about how entrepreneurs achieve their goals. In a traditional setting, a corporate manager might define a goal and then acquire the resources that he needs to achieve that goal. So kind of predefine an end and then acquire the means to achieve that end. Now that works very well in highly predictable environments, mature industries, known business models. But it's actually a very poor approach for highly unpredictable industries with unknown customers and unknown business models. So the best entrepreneurs actually do the exact opposite. They start with their means, who they are, whom they know, what they know, and actually create entirely new ends based on that unique combination of means. So for example, if I, as a seasoned entrepreneur, were trying to start a scribe outsourcing and automation company, I'd have a pretty hard time with it. I don't have the right means to achieve that end. However, Jared, the physician who started iScribes, had very appropriate means, including domain knowledge and a network of physicians who act as customers. Now, the best entrepreneurs are also very adept at expanding their means through partnerships, whether by bringing on co-founders or literally partnering their businesses with others. That's really important because by partnering, not only do you gain additional bandwidth and people power, but also you can actually expand the means to create entirely new ends that are unique only to that combination of means. So coming back again to iScribes, Jared the physician by himself might have had an okay time starting a scribe automation company. But once he brought on a scribe who had very specific domain knowledge, software engineers, user experience engineers, and outsourcing automation kind of business process specialists, he was able to leverage much more expansive means that are uniquely appropriate to his company. You've probably heard a lot about how entrepreneurs are always ready for failure and stare it down in the face with great courage. But it's really more than that. The best entrepreneurs not only embrace failure, but they really find a way to leverage surprise. In a startup, it's a question of when and how often, not if you'll achieve surprise. And the question is really what you do with it. So to go back to the Mike Tyson metaphor, as a startup is getting punched in the face repeatedly by customers and investors, the best entrepreneurs welcome that. They even seek that out because they're able to kind of catch that punch and jujitsu it into something that's actually an advantage for their company. Whether it's knowledge that their competitors don't have, whether it's input that they're able to incorporate into the next version of the product. Either way, they're able to take surprise and turn it into something that's actually very useful for the company. And there are even techniques that they can use to increase the rate at which they're surprised rather than sitting around in their office hoping for no surprises. Now, you've also probably heard that entrepreneurs are extremely risk-taking, that they're out there flying by the seat of their pants and staring death in the face. It turns out that psychological profiles of entrepreneurs have shown that on average they're slightly more risk averse than the population at whole. They just have a very different way of perceiving risk. So one of the great experiments done in effectuation was they took entrepreneurs, corporate managers, and bankers through decision-making simulations, and they found that there were very different approaches to making decisions. So the bankers and corporate managers would set a target return that they hoped to achieve, and they do everything they could to reduce the risk that they wouldn't achieve that return. So we want to earn 10% on our capital, for example, and we'll reduce risk by hedging or taking out insurance. Entrepreneurs, once again, do exactly the opposite. They set a maximum affordable loss, a maximum risk they're able to take, and then do everything they can to increase returns within the constraints of that acceptable risk. Now that's a really important distinction in mindset, but it also is relevant to the discussion of means and partnerships, because one great way to increase the amount of risk and loss that you're able to take on is through partnering with others. One of the biggest differences in mindset between effectual entrepreneurs and others was really about the kind of logic that they use to approach their businesses. So in highly predictable environments, such as mature businesses, mature industries, known business models, you can use causal logic. If we do X, Y, and Z, then we will achieve our goal. But that doesn't work in highly unpredictable environments, such as a startup. So instead, the best entrepreneurs use effectual logic, in which instead of predicting the future, they actually try to control it. And so the best metaphor I can think of for this type of logic has to do with, I had some time to spend with Bertrand Piccard, who is currently trying to fly a solar-powered airplane around the Earth. It's called Solar Impulse, very cool. But before he did that, he gained fame as the first person to circumnavigate the Earth in a hot air balloon. And when you're trying to circumnavigate the Earth in a hot air balloon, you certainly can't control the weather. You can't even predict the weather with all the fancy computers we have today. So you may find yourself with the wind blowing in the wrong direction, or you may find yourself approaching a storm, which could be very dangerous for the balloon. So you can't predict the weather, but you can control your altitude. You can move up to go over a storm. You can move down where the winds might be blowing you more in the direction you'd like to go. And so I think that's a fairly apt metaphor for effectual logic. Control what you can and create a future rather than trying to predict it and line up your actions to take advantage of that prediction. The, the effectuation principles altogether can be illustrated with a game. So it's a game which has a jar of multiple colored marbles, and you win the game by selecting a red marble. So we've got three different jars here. One is a completely transparent jar, so you can see inside which marbles are red and which ones are green. The other is an opaque jar, but you have a pretty good idea of the actual distribution of marbles inside it. And the third is a complete kind of black box jar. You have no idea what's inside that one. And entrepreneurship really closely models this third jar, the completely opaque one, in which the future is not only unpredictable and unknown, but actually unknowable, just because the entire universe of possibilities is so large. So it's pretty easy to craft strategies for success with the first two jars, right? If you can see into the jar, you can just reach in and pick out a red marble. If you can't see into the jar exactly, but you know the distribution of marbles, you can craft a pretty good strategy for success. If there are a higher percentage of red marbles than green marbles, you just kind of keep going until you actually pull out the red marble, or maybe if you only get one shot at it, you take one pick of a marble, but then hedge your bet with some kind of insurance or something to that effect. But how might an effectual entrepreneur create a strategy for dealing with this third jar, the completely opaque one where you have no idea what's inside? Well, the best entrepreneurs simply stuff that jar full of red marbles before making a selection, right? So again, coming back to this notion of controlling the future rather than trying to predict it. And furthermore, they make friends who have red marbles and they add those red marbles. So coming back to this notion of partnerships and expanding their means. Or if they find that they don't have many red marbles between them, maybe they only have blue marbles, well, they start playing a new game in which you win by selecting a blue marble, completely changing the rules of the game. So we've tried to cover at this point how the current kind of model of leadership in entrepreneurship is somewhat broken, but how we do actually know some things about what works in entrepreneurship. We broadly call these principles effectuation. So now let's see if we can actually conclude some leadership insights from the effectuation principles. The first lesson is to practice divergent thinking. And by divergent thinking, we're kind of brought up from day one in school to think very convergently, where there's a single answer out of multiple possibilities and you kind of converge on that right answer. Divergent thinking is effectively the opposite. And to illustrate that, let's say I ask you to, what is that building made out of? And the answer might be brick, for example. That's very convergent thinking. Divergent thinking would be if I said, okay, within 30 seconds, give me all the possible uses of brick that you can think of. And so, making buildings, for example, and many other things. And we're typically quite bad at divergent thinking, but that's what's necessary if we're going to start with our means and create new ends based on those means. But it's important not just to think divergently yourself as a leader, but also to develop the capacity and tendency toward divergent thinking in those whom you're leading. And during this presentation, someone asked me for any particular strategies for doing that. And I think in many ways, it comes down to the ways that you interact with your employees and questions that you ask. So instead of just telling people what to do, um, one step closer to the mark is asking them how we should do it. But even better is asking them to think a little bit outside the box of what you would hope to accomplish, and say, well, what's possible? What could we be doing? And once you've kind of agreed on something, well, what else is possible? So things like brainstorming are classic exercises in divergent thinking, and they tend to get lost in the go, rush, high anxiety environments of high growth startups. I don't really know how to pronounce the saying that's on this mural, but it's a Latinization of a Greek saying from the Temple of the Oracle of Delphi that means know thyself. Right? Self-assessment and knowledge is incredibly important in a startup, not just because it helps you understand your own gaps that need to be filled by others with other skill sets, but also because if you're going to start with your means and then create new ends based on those means, well, you've got to know what your means actually are. So self-assessment and external assessment, I think, is incredibly important in a startup. So you have tools like 360 assessment, in which both people above you and below you and around you are giving you, feedback, as well as kind of real-time feedback between you and employees is incredibly important on everything they do. It creates this kind of rapid feedback loop that allows employees to know themselves as well, so that they can think about their means and what's possible to achieve through them. So expanding means through partnerships doesn't have to be limited just to the company level. It actually can provide a lot of benefit internally as well. So as a leader, it's important to take action to foster more collaboration among your employees. In the software world, there's a technique known as pair programming, in which two software engineers, or sometimes even more, will actually essentially program software together. And in some cases, it's been shown to be more productive than each of them doing something individually, especially if they're working on something, a piece of software that might have to interface between one programmer's software and someone else's, or if one programmer is trying to solve a problem and having a particular challenge. Having that extra set of eyes can be incredibly helpful. And so I suggest that things like pair programming shouldn't be limited just to software engineers. There are all kinds of projects going on throughout a startup, and the temptation for productivity reasons is to divide and conquer and have everyone working on his or her own individual thing. Based on the effectuation principles, there's a lot of value in actually assigning multiple people to kind of team up on something that might normally be just an individual project. Now, one of the nice side effects of that is that actually, if someone gets sick or leaves the company or what have you, you have a lot more kind of redundancy of intrinsic knowledge as well. As I mentioned when I was talking about how the best entrepreneurs really embrace and leverage surprise, there are things that a leader can do to increase the kind of incidence rate or hit rate of surprise. And one is to really to push employees out of the building. Whether employees are technical or marketing or finance, if they are kind of always constrained, kind of staying inside the office, their ability to encounter something completely unpredictable that might give them a new idea, or some new direction to pursue within the company is somewhat limited. So any action that could actually get employees out of the building, interacting with other people, sometimes so we've had a lot of success actually really pushing our technical employees, for example, out to be part of the different technical meetups in the different areas in which they're active, or sometimes even in areas in which they aren't active, because it just seeds additional ideas. And often they see an idea that someone else is using in a very different way, and it fosters some new thinking about ways that we might actually leverage that type of technology, or even something totally laterally, not even that technology at all, but it's given them some new idea and some new thread to follow. especially if you can get employees engaged and kind of rubbing elbows with customers. That's incredibly beneficial. Nothing's worse than having a bunch of people developing a product in a business that are completely isolated and removed from the customer. So anytime you can actually uh, increase the amount of time that your employees, again, regardless of function, are spending with customers, you find the rate of aha moments just dramatically increases. And if you're really looking to change the rules of the game with your startup, you need to question everything until there's some kind of validated evidence. All of the assumptions that you have, all of the kind of predefined notions that your employees will have, are really put there by the existing incumbents in the space in which you're operating. But your whole goal is actually to change the rules of the game that those incumbents have set. So whenever anyone asserts something like, hey, we should do XYZ, or hey, this is a best practice, it's important really to challenge that. Is that is that a fact, or is that a hypothesis? Is that based on data and evidence, or is that based on assumption? And asking, kind of the 5 whys to really get to the root of issues is incredibly important. Now, it's important not just for you as a leader to be pushing back and asking these questions of your employees, but also for your employees to feel empowered to ask those questions of you. We've discussed several leadership approaches that are easier to discuss than they are really to implement. Right? Things like creating a culture of candid feedback, a culture in which employees not only embrace surprise but even seek it out, and a culture in which employees feel comfortable challenging the assumptions of leadership is actually quite difficult, especially in a startup where everything is so go, 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 rush, rush, rush. That focusing on things like culture can be tough. At the end of the day, though, you need employees to be able to kind of take these kinds of risks and embrace this type of culture. So if I had to propose kind of one single greatest leadership strategy in startups, it's around the concept of secure base leadership. So as children, we gain the confidence to learn to walk, to take steps, to risk failure by falling down, but then to pick ourselves back up and keep trying until we succeed, because we have a parent or loved one or caregiver there to act as a secure base for us, someone to pick us back up when we fall down, maybe even to pat us on the back and make us feel better when we've experienced the pain of failure. And that gives us the confidence to keep trying until we succeed. That neurochemistry becomes so hardwired into us that it's a model that continues to be incredibly effective for us even as adults. So a secure base is a kind of a person, place, or thing that even as adults gives us that type of strength and confidence. So as a person, it might be someone in your life who will still love you and support you even if you fail. So for me, for example, my wife and mother absolutely serve in those roles. Even if I fall flat on my face, I know that they'll still be there for me and they'll still believe in me. As a place, for example, Rice University, where I spent my time as an undergrad, where I was selected by my peers for a major leadership position, where I met my wife, or IMD Business School, where kind of situated right on the shores of Lake Geneva. I can look up at the mountains and Mont Blanc and the lake and just be incredibly inspired by my surroundings. These are places where every time I go and spend a little time, it's kind of like Superman basking in the warm glow of Earth's yellow sun. I just feel supercharged, confident, and ready to take on the world. For some people, a secure base is a thing. So it might be a talisman of sorts, a special necklace that grandmother gave you, or for me, actually, I'll wear specific cufflinks when I go in for a big presentation or to give a big talk or have a big meeting, and kind of I feel like I've got a kind of an armor on and something that gives me extra powers. For some people, it might even be a ritual, doing yoga or meditation, but anything that kind of gives someone that secure base on which to stand and from which they have the confidence to take risks. Um, as a startup, it's very important that your employees have the confidence to take risks. And so it's very important that you, as a leader, can act as that secure base for employees. They need to know that they can take risks, that they might fail, and that you will support them. I mean, you might help them try to figure out what you learned from the failure and kind of improve on it in the next iteration, but that you won't chastise them and fire them just because they took a risk and it didn't quite work out right. It's just as important as well for you as the leader to identify your secure bases and ensure that you're spending enough time with them. Again, in the hot startup world where you're always under the gun, it can be easy to neglect yourself and the time you're spending with mentors or the time you're spending in places that are special for you. But you can't be a secure base for your employees unless you have enough contact with secure bases in your own life. This has been just a brief overview of leadership topics that are very specific to startups. There are many out there with much greater knowledge and experience in both entrepreneurship and leadership. So I'd welcome feedback and discussion that you have. But if I can leave you with just one thing, it's that throughout my own startup experience, through successes and failures, one of the only things that you always take with you from one startup experience to the next is the relationships you develop with the people you're working with. And so for that reason, I think leadership is really, really important in a startup. It's important to get those relationships and get that leadership right. So I hope this is helpful. I hope that you'll put these principles into practice, and happy venturing, everyone.